I actually worked initially as water engineer in Auckland. And I just very vividly recall the first time I opened up our GIS system and turned on the layers related to the underground infrastructure. There's all manner of infrastructure required beyond just a length of pipe. I highly recommend anybody do it. Just, go look at your local city or GIS and just turn on those layers and just get a sense of the scale of what's being built and what is being maintained under the city, just so that you can turn a tap and push a button and the water goes away again. We're talking about thousands and thousands of kilometers of pipes, valves, pipe bridges, every little stream or road. Those need to be constantly checked and maintained. Otherwise, just an entire portion of the city is without water. And then you've reservoirs, treatment plants. It inspires a certain sense of awe. And I think about the fact that a very small group of people in each individual town, and us collectively as a society, built this thing such that people can ignore it and just have, the most fundamental kind of component of life, safe, clean drinking water whenever they please.
Hi-ho, everybody. My name is Patrick McKenzie, better known as Patio11 on the internet, and I'm here with my buddy Adam Jarvis. Adam writes the public service substack. He also has worked in public service for the last several decades in New Zealand at the local level. And so we're here to talk about the challenges of local government, of achieving projects in the physical world, and how it is not entirely appreciated by people who are outside of it and feel like tech and adjacent spaces are critical of government for the right reasons some of the time and often misunderstand how the institution works. And so wanted to have a subject matter expert on that. So Adam, welcome to the discussion.
Well, thanks for having me.
So do you want to give people just a little bit of background on, I suppose we could go as broad as what does local government do, but let's give people some context. What's the size of local government you work in and on what do you work?
Sure. So local government across the Anglosphere, shall we say, takes on a range of different roles. Sometimes involves police, fire, education even. In New Zealand, it's more limited to essentially public infrastructure around stormwater, potable water, wastewater, transport, local transport initiatives, not so much state highways, but, local roads, libraries, waste collection, cemeteries, kind of the in general, the sort of the day-to-day things that most people are, I think, interacting with when they think about the city.
Mm-hmm.
How the city's designed, how the sort of public spaces look, how they maintained, and those sorts of things. So over the last 10 years, I've been really quite privileged to work for an institution in a city about 100,000, the local government in New Zealand, and it's of a size that has, on the one hand, the resources to be able to achieve some quite innovative things. We can talk a little bit about some of the constraints of institutions that are smaller and really struggle with talent retention and so on, if you're interested. But on the other hand, it's large enough to have resource, but it's small enough that you can go and talk to the mayor if you need to, or the chief executive, the people on the ground. We're highly connected, and that's given me the opportunity to do some really interesting things. I've reintroduced locally extinct bird species to our city. I delivered the city's first separated cycleway. We've reformed the way that we do particularly low carbon investment, taking a sort of a more robust and cost benefit type approach, which then sort of use that as a stalking horse to change the way that our council invests more generally. So it's been a real privilege, and it's an area I'm passionate about and keen to, see continue to improve for the sake of,
So just zooming in on one of those, because unfortunately there is a close parallel in a local government that is quite local to us as we are recording this. We're recording this in Berkeley, California. And just across the bay, my sense of SFBA geography is terrible. The San Francisco also did a separated bicycleway, which you might or might not have read about. I'll drop people links in the show notes to the official write-ups on that. But achieving results in the physical world is non-trivial relative to many other projects or just writing something. What's the time frame look like on a project like a SEP bicycleway?
Sure. So I think before we get into that, I think one of the things that people misunderstand about delivery in the public sector relative to the private is that there's an element of like essentially political capital that is just critical to understand anything. And so before you get into timeframes, the more important factor of delivery, because depending on the context, a cycle way, you might be able to do it in 6 months. It may take years, depending on, the sort of environment that you're in, how much support you have, how much ability there is to do something quick that maybe is not, all bells and whistles, isn't kind of beautiful infrastructure. Maybe people will complain about because it looks ugly, but you're using that to test ultimately the alignment rapidly, such that you can then, once you've sorted out and disappointed virtually everybody, but at a sustainable rate, so the cycling community is not happy with it, but they can live with it, and the drivers that use that route, you've resolved issues around parking or loading zones and all of these kinds of like things that we don't think about until they're disrupted, and you can go through a process in a matter of weeks, really, from the first time you get on the ground, maybe 6 months of prep, rapidly iterate, and then deliver the kind of the bricks and mortar or the concrete of the physical infrastructure, the permanent installation, rapidly. But what tends to happen instead is the more that you have formal process, the long and particularly process that is imposed upon a local government by, let's say, a funding agency, whether it's the state or the national government or what have you, of this is how we select projects, and you've got to do a series of business case processes which will become so complex that they need a substantial consultant involvement, hundreds of thousands of dollars, even just before you get into actually planning the route or any specifics about where the cycleway will actually go between one block and the next, you might be looking at years of process to get through.
I'm glad that you mentioned funding, because it is often unclear for end users of a particular thing that in private industry there might be a complex capital stack, but it's typically sitting behind the entire organization, and then the organization is doing funding from one unified budget. This largely doesn't carry over to the public sector, particularly not in Anglosphere nations. There is often the capital stack, as it were, coming from some combination of local one hop up and then national funds, which are often administered independently of each other. And due to constraints in the funding environment, a group within government that wants to get a particular project accomplished might be attempting to map that against multiple different sources of money at multiple levels with perhaps orthogonal things that they want out of it.
Yes, and probably going further, often, I mean, one of the real problems that we have at the moment is the fact that every policy, every funding kind of arrangement is often, even just from one source, there's maybe 8 different objectives that a project needs to meet, which is essentially impossible to, this complex system of trade-offs, in theory, that would need to be made around these 8 different objectives, let alone the slightly different objectives that the other funding agency has, or the local government has, or the community has. And so in practice, it's a game that is played, because very often, the political process creates a situation in which there's no clear majority opinion on this particular policy that this is the priority followed by this. Rather, instead, in order to meet different pressure groups and constituencies' values, instead you get a set of objectives that's kind of everything to everybody and nothing to everybody as well. So instead of needing to clearly demonstrate this, although that is the case in some cases, or in many cases, there's an implicit, that would be the way to put it, objective that needs to be met if you talk to the right bureaucrats or what have you. Oh, we want X, but nevertheless, the process is one that, it needs to be, whatever it is that you want to do, needs to be contorted and, let's say 8, probably more, depending on how many agencies are involved, different ways.
We're sitting on top of 100 plus years of organizational scar tissue. And I love this. I think I originally heard it from Jason Fried, who was talking in the private sector context. But everything that has gone wrong in the government for 100 years has a regulatory or legislative band-aid attached to it. We are sitting on strata of sediment. And so it is extremely easy for legislators to write into law a requirement that anything which uses national funds will do this process to counter corruption. Also, we would like this process for, generally speaking, we have some public goals with respect to public employment and perhaps equity concerns thereof.
Sure. Yeah.
We also have some environmental concerns. And in particular, there was this one person in the 1970s who really cared about birds. And so please answer the questionnaire about bird habitat and et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these are perhaps not proximate to the fundamental concerns that are driving the marginal project, but they are the law. And it is very difficult as people within the government to not obey the law.
Sure.
So one feels constrained.
So, I mean, just, there's the classic example of HS2 and the various work of the high-speed rail in England being kind of forever project to the Californian high-speed rail is saying rail projects are just like, this is such a great example of them because, there's all kinds of, they're spatially very large, they're large across time. So, each layer of process is like multiplied by all the different environments that you're going through. The fact that this project is, expected to be built over multiple years means that series of regulations is, so you end up with, let's say, just on the pure math of it, 40 times, the work involved. And I don't know an awful lot about it, but there's the case of the Biden clean investment, which, as I understand it, none was spent. None of that allocation was spent.
I think it's a complicated story where the ground truth is something different than the one that is articulated for political consumption. But broadly, like we were discussing, there is this funding phase before the planning phase, before the implementation phase. And the structural reality of the American funding phase is that you will end up in a proposal cycle and then a budgeting cycle and then a deployment cycle, which does not necessarily align with, say, I don't know, one's desire for state capacity or one's electoral timelines.
Right.
And so there is, unless you invoke emergency authorities, in expectation, a project decided on X will not possibly spend money before Y. But then there is some level of dysfunction on top of that, like base iron law, and that iron law is itself a form of dysfunction.
Right. So one of the interesting things here, I think, is that, you've got politicians, let's say, or public stakeholders generally are incentivized to, see that their thing is implemented, and the mechanism through which that occurs is like legislation, either primary or secondary. What that system of incentives creates ultimately is one in which every single project is viewed myopically. So rather than taking a step back where we might say, okay, like, what do we want? We want to, let's say, cleaner rivers. And how would that most effectively be achieved? Is it through spending $500 million of a small town's money on making marginal improvements to their wastewater treatment plant? Maybe, but we should also, in an ideal world, look at, okay, well, where are the sources of pollution in this river? What are the most effective ways to reduce nitrogen levels? And if we were to spend, let's say, $500 million on clean water infrastructure in this catchment, you could almost guarantee that it would not be whatever it was that process has created, because we're consenting a new wastewater treatment plant. So therefore, every single desire for improved social, environmental, economic outcomes is kind of channeled through this particular project, which blows out costs enormously and timeframes even before you get to building.
It also does something which has been described in other places as promiscuously distributing vetoes, where the alignment of political capital in a particular community or nation results in, for anything that you do, there are the groups or institutions which are primarily responsible for it, but there are any number of other stakeholders who would, I think the cynical way to say it is, attempt to get their piece of any additional funding or
Sure.
opportunity which comes. A perhaps less cynical way to phrase it is they are valued stakeholders with regards to things that the local polity has decided that it values. And one maintains that status in society by always having a comment on the new thing that is coming down the pike. And so means that the number of people that you have to consult with respect to the new thing that is coming down the pike grows larger and larger over time. And that one's incentive as someone who is being asked to comment on these things is to always have just a little bit of a disagreement and a little bit of, oh, we're going to need some modifications, or you stop getting asked to show up in the next iteration of the game.
Or even less cynically than that, one could say that the complexity of modern society is so great that ideally you might bring these people together or maybe the political process in a way is intended to do this itself and ask them, like, in general, we have this many resources, this sort of capacity. How would that be allocated most efficiently to achieve your particular outcomes? But because that conversation is impossible to have because we're just doing so many different things, people who have limited attention spans, or limited attention, rather, in general. Instead, if you want to see an outcome, you value your river or your local community or whatever it is. The only way, in effect, that you're going to be able to have the sort of influence that you like and make marginal improvements is to involve yourself in that kind of fashion. So there's a gap there that remains to be filled. I'm hopeful that kind of, modern systems, potentially AI, might be in a position to help grease those particular wheels in order to enable that to happen more. But I can definitely see how we've gotten into the position that we're in, through the incentives that you're talking about, or just more generally that something comes up and, I value so-and-so and I want that to be expressed in this project, because if everything is done myopically, then you need to go with the flow and advocate for things in each individual circumstance, or you will achieve literally nothing.
I also think that for a variety of reasons, we have the day-to-day keeping the lights on work of running industrial civilization, which people often only appreciate when it's gone. I think running tap water is a wonderful thing, and I think many people think running tap water is abundant in nature.
Sure.
And it turns out that there are, you have the benefit of being a civil engineer. What's the bus number on tap water for a town of 100,000 people? Like, how many people would need to stop doing their job before tap water ceased?
So I think in our town, 100,000, the entire system, not including when you would bring on consultants or contractors to do a major renewal project. So leaving aside kind of long-term capital maintenance, but rather just it's a team of probably 8 people or something like that. Between the treatment technicians, they're actually just monitoring ongoing dosage of chlorine and so on, quality rates, a couple of engineers, and maybe some that would include probably overheads as well of like the finance team that helps.
And so probabilistically speaking, if 2 to 3 people that have differentiated technical skills or similar simply stopped doing the water, we would stop having the water after a period of probably days.
Yeah. I remember when I started my career, I actually worked initially as water engineer in Auckland, our largest city. And I just very vividly recall the first time I opened up our GIS system and turned on the layers related to the underground infrastructure. And it is, I highly recommend anybody do it. Just spend, go look at your local city or GIS and just turn on those layers and just get a sense of the scale of what's being built and what is being maintained under the city, just so that you can turn a tap and push a button and the water goes away again. We're talking about thousands and thousands of kilometers of pipes, valves, pipe bridges, every little stream or road sometimes will have some, there's all manner of infrastructure required beyond just a length of pipe in order to make the air bubbles accumulate in high points in the pipe need to be released, otherwise the pressure increases or flow is reduced. Then that needs to be, those need to be constantly checked and maintained, otherwise just an entire portion of the city is without water. And then you've reservoirs, treatment plants. It inspires a certain sense of awe almost in me, in a way, when I think about the fact that a very small group of people in each individual town, and us collectively as a society have built this thing such that people can ignore it and just have, the most fundamental kind of component of life, safe, clean drinking water whenever they please. It makes me feel a sense of awe.
I think that's exactly the word I look for when discussing infrastructure, and think that some subcomponents of that, we do not appreciate how we live in an age of miracles. And we also don't appreciate that, like you said, kilometers of pipes with flow meters and various widgets attached to them, and that was very intentionally designed by people. That none of it is by accident, and by a centimeter by centimeter, I suppose, in your neck of the woods. It is all, well, there is probably a plan written down somewhere that has it all laid out, and then there's a slight difference between that plan and as built, but was laboriously designed, often before computers existed.
I would say it actually tends to be more iterative.
Oh, okay.
Over time, growth patterns of cities. There's quite a large subject, and it's kind of fascinating. We could go into, but cities have grown very organically over time.
Mm-hmm.
Most places that have done some enormous kind of top-down modernist type,
Mm-hmm.
I think those cities, by and large, there's a general consensus now that
Yep.
kind of approach has failed. Instead, what you tend to get is a more sort of, we look 10 years out, perhaps maybe 30 years out. Where is growth happening? What kind of infrastructure can we, and then we kind of go back through the existing infrastructure and look at, okay, well, what kind of capacity is going to need to be introduced here? And
yep. Not saying that the entire town is planned out in advance of need, but that every decision at a fractal level,
sure. Yeah.
Does this pipe go up or down? Does it have a junction here? Was a human making that decision intentionally at some point.
Yeah. Isn't a funny thing though? In the older cities, probably a lot more than you realize is not on any plan anywhere.
Yes, certainly the case.
There would be times, again, my first job out of university, where we'd be called out, there'd be water just spraying up from somewhere. We'd look on GIS, there'd be nothing there.
Mm-hmm.
But clearly there is. And, you get a digger out and there's some like rusted old piece of cast iron that, has been connected and pressurized well past its use-by date. But, record keeping it's extremely difficult to keep track of all that thing, surveying. You think about the level of precision required to understand in the 1900 where exactly everything was relative to a city plan, let alone in the z-axis, which is often the difficulties lie.
Speaking of z-axes, in my hometown of Chicago, the persistent water quality issues were difficult to solve given the physical geography of the city, and so the most achievable option for re-engineering that was, okay, we think we should just move the z-axis 3 meters upwards. And so engineers in, I believe, the late 1800s elevated the city of Chicago by approximately 3 meters. And
wow,
I love reading history like that because, wow, it actually happened. Wow, we somehow had the capacity to do that
phenomenal.
Prior to computers and similar existing. Or even, you'd have, one would assume at that time, very little ability to even, use like fossil fuel based sources of work. And yet we did it. We took what was then a fairly sizable city and raised it by just like the physics involved are staggering, to say nothing of the political or economic implications.
In my case, in New Zealand, it's sort of, we get the opposite end where you're talking about a nation that, in the case of the early 1900s, New Zealand Europeans had only really been there for 100-odd years, Māori a few hundred years more, and extraordinary isolation, both like in general. If you look where New Zealand is on a map, it's absolutely in the middle of nowhere, assuming it's on the map at all. Little joke there. And then fractally, you end up in a position where even for a fairly significant city, you can go out into essentially the bush, we call it, which is kind of like, essentially it's a rainforest full of dense vines and essentially impenetrable. And then way up in the middle of nowhere, there's like a 120 meter tall concrete dam that was built in 1911 to supply a fledgling city, 30 kilometers away. And for modern machinery, before certainly anything to do with GIS or anything, people achieve this. And again, there's a certain sense of awe when you kind of appreciate their context. But I think, we were talking about this a little bit offline, is the idea that I think all manner of things were done through the public sector to address needs that everybody could see were important. Let's say 100 years ago, even as recently as kind of in the early post-war era, electricity lines are all being built out rapidly and so on, because we want electricity, obviously. And over time, that kind of capacity, that dynamism that was in the public sector is perhaps quite rightly, and what you could make the argument, shifted to the private sector, and people have built all kinds of wonderful things, particularly here in Silicon Valley. But because there's been a gap in transmission of knowledge, of process, of understanding of how to do that kind of thing, and then to come back to your point, instead we've got accumulated scar tissue, and I think we're at a period now, as we go through another period of great change, of changing demographics. Some cities are being emptied out. We think about Detroit, and facing enormous challenges with accumulated debt load, and both financial, but probably even more importantly, just technical debt of these pipe systems and so on that were built for a city fundamentally of a different size. And extrapolating out this idea across the public sector more generally, I feel very strongly that, that far more attention needs to be paid once again to just, setting things up for the next few generations that come after us so the time's once again to build these great dams, but perhaps not quite in that fashion, and not necessarily a dam per se, but to revivify what we're doing.
I feel with moderate confidence that one of the factors that we are having here is that describe this concept on Twitter occasionally as the sort, which America is engaged in quite enthusiastically in the course of the last few generations, and which I think other nations have their own version of, where at one point when our forefathers were busy setting up things, the society was lamentably inefficient in identifying talent and sending it to work in various places through a variety of mechanisms, some of which we rightly look back at with horror. Societies discriminated against women, many groups in various societies, etc. And just fundamentally, they were not very good at looking across the range of the population and saying, you look like you could be a very productive civil engineer. Or you look like you could work very well in finance. And as a result, people got attached to projects through a variety of social processes. And some of those social processes favored certain institutions. So if you grew up in the third largest city in Illinois, you were likely to stay very local to them and be tracked into very local positions. And if you both grew up there, had some amount of ambition, some amount of social capital, and bluntly but descriptively were in the right demographic situation, you might end up as a public works administrator. And then society got much better at running the sort. And the positive ramification of that was we ran a nationwide and increasingly worldwide semi-meritocratic process on let's identify smart people earlier. We will track them into high-status institutions by a variety of processes, which use some amount of high-stakes testing, and then we will sort of track them from that high-status institution to a very dynamic sector of the economy, whether it be finance or tech or similar. And that was an economic engine for us for many years. However, it meant that, my grandfather's grandfather's generation, someone who might have been in public works in a small city in Illinois, will likely be identified very early in their life as a go-getter and basically tracked into Google or tracked into finance at New York or similar. And so we have this batch of cultural projects, which we are the inheritors of, but we experience in the present that it is very difficult to create something of their like, despite not having lost the knowledge. It's just the people who would do it are in other places.
Well, and there's a few things I could add to that. I think unprecedented labor mobility is an underappreciated aspect of that.
Yes.
As not only are we better at identifying people, but they're in general far lower costs to move in, both moving companies, moving locations. The internet is great to be able to identify a new place to live and a new community to be a part of. People are having much smaller families, or if they're having families at all. So rather than something tying you to a particular town that you want to invest in over a long period of time, you end up, far less attached to any particular role. You may end up as a public administrator for a few years, but tendency is within to move quickly into a different role. And I think even within the public sector, to the extent that talent is sorted into the public sector, I think there are challenges resulting from this kind of lack of this mobility. And to just give you one example, I think there's a host of ways in which the public sector in particular is reliant on like long-term reputations. And it needn't necessarily be so, and yet it is. And the expectation when I started my career in general, or the systems of hiring and so on, really very much in the realm of, somebody would have worked in maybe that one institution for 40 years. And certainly within that profession, let's say as a water engineer. And if you're hiring water engineers or administrators of water engineers who once were engineers themselves, and they make some catastrophic kind of series of process changes that dramatically increase costs and are highly kind of disruptive to ways of working, that might not actually show up for 5 years, right? Like the infrastructure continues to sit there. The most pressing things continue to get done, but you end up in a position where, only 80% of the previous capacity is still existing because there's all of this terrible new process. But that person has moved on potentially twice by this point to do roles, and the feedback mechanisms. So the incentives to do a job that is durable and delivering value across time within the role are lower, and at the same time the mechanisms for deciding who it is you need in order to help resolve your problems are unchanged. And so we're kind of, this person's done something prestigious and they've sorted themselves in effect into this role, but actually in effect they're unsuited to it. And so I think one of the, it's just I'm talk on this topic a long time, but I think it's one thing Silicon Valley has done very well is modernizing hiring practices in light of this. And, I know you worked at Stripe, read Claire's book about, hiring and having externals within a meeting that can kind of introduce some sort of additional rigor to that. I think that kind of reform is long overdue in the public sector, because we're still very much in this space of hiring someone who sort of seems suitable, and then they come in for an interview with the boss or something, and he seems like a person I could work with, because essentially they're, the interview is this person going to be an enormous pain in the ass to me or not? Not, are they going to be, are they the most qualified person for the solving problems over a long period of time?
If I can just jump in and say something about labor mobility, another factor that we've experienced in the last couple of decades is agglomeration effects. And so I think we deal with this both in the subnational levels and at the national levels. It's sometimes the phrase brain drain is sometimes used
particularly in New Zealand. Yeah.
I hate that phrasing of things as someone who immigrated for economic reasons in my adult life, and then have immigrated again back to my nation of birth. But be that as it may, there are smaller communities which typically don't have extremely dynamic industrial sectors. And then there are some descriptively larger cities that do have dynamic industrial sectors, or even in the public sector, they have high status government institutions which are doing national government policy. And so, for example, if you look at Japan, the Japanese population is contracting over time. In fact, is very well known domestically and internationally. The population of Tokyo continues to go up. And this is partly because all of the big companies and all of the jobs are in Tokyo. And if one is working in the government and one is ambitious, one would probably prefer to, work at the Ministry of the Interior in Tokyo. The career paths of Japanese public servants is a thing that I cannot speculate on for a great deal of detail, but working at the Ministry of the Interior and then going on the various career paths that will be offered to you after that is, generally speaking, higher status, results in higher pay, etc., than simply going to work for Ogaki City Hall, my town of residence in semi-rural Japan, and being the one of three people that is making sure that water continues to get delivered.
Assuming that there's any role at all for you there, right?
Yes.
Because what's alongside this contracting population problem is also that we're also living longer as well. And so there's, as the same time that a city maybe has less resources to, maintain the infrastructure that it has, the services levels that it has, the rating base is shrinking. People that are there are seeing this, are, not necessarily in a position to kind of jump out of the public sector into a different role, opening that role for them. Instead, every incentive, if you want to stick around in those towns, is to stay in that role until you retire, and resources for internships or more junior level roles that once existed probably aren't anymore, because it's difficult to justify the value that those have. So if you're wanting a role in the public sector even, then chances are you're going to have to leave, right?
And there are other structural factors in the public sector which are downstream of political choices of the polity. I'm afraid I don't know how they work in New Zealand, but for example, at the federal level in the United States, if there are layoffs, it has to be the low seniority employees first, with some asterisks that one can make with regards to like preferences for veterans and similar.
Sure.
But if you assume that there are, over a time scale of decades, some years which are pretty flush, in which there's a lot of budget, and then some years which are either less flush or for whatever reason a political imperative is to contract the size of the government, then that contraction will typically happen at the descriptively younger workers, descriptively lower ranks on the totem pole, and not near the top.
Sure. And relatedly, just coming back to a point I was talking about earlier in terms of hiring, I think we also haven't really begun to come to terms with the fact that, maybe this is specifically in New Zealand, but I think across the Anglosphere, that it's getting a bad hire in the private sector is, a bad fit. Maybe no judgment on this particular individual, but they're just not the right person for the role. Is orders of magnitude, from what I gather, easier to rectify than in the public sector. And where essentially you're in a position where you have to restructure the entire organization. You cannot fire somebody because they're the wrong person, unless they're, committing like an HR type offense, something of that nature, criminal problems. But if they're simply just, hey, it's our bad, we hired the wrong person for this, you're a great person, essentially that person is there for life until somebody makes the decision that we are going to completely shake up the entire, group or unit that person is involved in, and have to specifically remove that role as well. You can't simply have, there's case law around this, to replace that role with a similar named role somewhere else or anything like that. The role actually has to be disestablished.
Yeah. I came up in the social system that is being a Japanese salaryman, and large traditionally minded Japanese employers feel, and to some degree are by law and regulation constrained from ever firing someone in a particular job class. And so they've come up with when you describe this to Americans, but it's oidashibe, a room designed to cause people to want to leave your organization, where you subject people to a degree of essentially psychological torture by making it very clear to them that they are unneeded, and in some cases giving them newspapers, asking them to copy out the newspaper longhand, and then ripping up the copy in front of their face at the end of the day to just demonstrate to them how little value they're creating.
Sure.
And when I heard that word for the first time, and even, experienced the reality of it in Japan, that sounded wild to me. And then I realized that New York City has the same institution, called by a different name, obviously, because they don't speak much Japanese in New York City, for school teachers who have run afoul of the administration for reasons such as, I don't know, it turns out being drunk in class is not that effective at achieving great student outcomes, but which makes it, various contracts and labor protections and regulations and laws make it difficult to get rid of that person. And so they have a parallel institution where they will warehouse someone for a few years while trying to convince them to quit.
So I have some degree of sympathy for these rules, but you mentioned, coming back to this idea of scar tissue, I think in a world of low labor mobility where you're tied to a particular town, let's say, and there's the local steel mill or what have you, which is the primary employer, and all of your friends and all of your family are there, and you intend to stay there for the rest of your life, and you're in an economy with like low sort capacity, shall we say, to like open some other kind of role, retrain you later. Actually, the power balance in that sort of situation is very much in the company in the absence of labor protection laws and so on. And so actually I think it, in that sort of world that people lived in the early 20th century, those kinds of things were, I think, a lot more reasonable than they are now, where the power balance is not so much you shall do what we say or you will be fired from the steel mill and thus effectively be made destitute.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said that, and would elaborate that, particularly for sort of specialization where the government is essentially a monopolistic employer. I suppose the most obvious one would be military, because no one needs a fighter pilot unless they are the Air Force. But for civil engineers in water engineering, an example, I suppose there's quite a bit of water engineering done in civic industry, but water engineering done for a specialization that would cause you to be working on like a city systems. There is one employer for the city, and you're stuck with it. And if one believes that there is low labor mobility, if there is no liquidity between cities or other things, then that person would find themselves in a very untenable situation if they specialized for 18 years and then were cut for reasons fair or foul.
Sure.
And so we, in part to convince people to spend your one shot in life on getting sufficiently expert at water systems such that you can be one of the three individuals who prevents all of us from dying of thirst 18 years from now, you do have to pre-commit to them to give some level of protections. So I can intellectually appreciate that it is a sort of more rational than it might seem to someone in the sort of most free market part of an economics department, and also hold that thought at the same time, as it seems a little bit ridiculous that we end up with teachers who are drunk in class and continue having jobs for many years after that fact.
Sure. I see a need for a host of reform in these places, but it's often not some black and white thing that's required here, but just a subtle realignment based on the environment that we now find ourselves in, where, you can, if somebody's drunk in the classroom. I don't know, I haven't heard that example before or anything of that magnitude. New Zealand. But I think we need to reaffirm the idea that our foremost duty is ultimately to the public, and that as our institutions should, as part of that, look after the people that they hire. But that actually we need to get, in the first instance, better at hiring, and then also better at firing in those cases where it's necessary, and in such a way that those people can leave with their head held high and with grace, and the rest, that potentially there's no judgment there of them personally, but actually it was our fault, which I think, there's, as I said, thinking of Stripe, have been quite inspired by, the efforts in that regard of that institution that we could learn from.
I think there's definitely not speaking for anybody but myself with this, but certainly a dignity to labor element that I feel certain social systems in the world do better, and certain social systems in the world could stand to improve on. The zone of the achievable in, say, American politics might be increasing the level of felt dignity while decreasing the level of structural protections. Might be a trade that everyone benefits from. But things such as, if one makes it the rule that one is only able to fire someone for gross moral turpitude or incompetence, then the fact of firing someone is a signal of gross moral turpitude or incompetence. And so one will be disincentivized at the margin to do things where, this organization's work style and your organization's work style are, no judgment on either of us, just not that compatible. There are many other organizations in the world, perhaps pursuing your job and, pursue your fortune, one of the other ones, and you will be happier and we will be happier, is a no judgment thing that you could tell people. And, I'm a very low conflict individual. Some people, enjoy having boisterous debates that might involve shouting at their workplace. And in a place where everyone is a low conflict individual and the corporate culture is quite averse to conflict, having a very shouty person is, you are not being fair to that person, you're not being fair to the ones around them. And similarly, there might be a high conflict place where I would be a less than effective employee, and perhaps they would shout at me and ask me to leave. But if one makes it the rule that, one literally needs to violate the law to be exited from this place, that cases that are closer on the margin of, you haven't stolen from the public purse, you haven't abused one of your colleagues, you haven't committed gross, felonies or misdemeanors in front of us, you're just ineffective at your job.
Or, I think increasingly, the capacity is already there, thanks to the people in this city, to just that a lot of work that we used to do is now redundant, and that can be, that text data can now be processed as if in a similar fashion to numerical data, and yet we've got, hosts of people that 5 years ago were necessary to be able to text data from one format and put it into another. And that it's something that we're going to have to grapple with.
AI is rolling down the hill like a boulder at us on this one, because unfortunately, but descriptively, there are many people who are currently doing data processing jobs which could be done better by a computer, but that has not been done due to the portion of public sector hiring, which is a jobs program, and an unwillingness to redeploy them towards other things. It's always easier to keep the department doing what the department has always done. There are relatively large portions, I would say, of the public sector where they're not doing data processing simply in, here's a stack of forms, I type them into my machine, and we process business rules on them. But they're doing one level higher than that.
Sure.
Like making decisions based on
drafting documents would be one such case. Not a decision maker, but themselves, but are there to support that by taking a set of ideas, let's say, putting that into a format that's like suitable for public consumption, like a new stormwater strategy or something of this nature. Not specific.
Even just the work of, like, we have public commentary periods in many parts of the United States political process, and one of the jobs that staff has to do is to take the public comment, which might come from everyone from the man on the street to a distinguished professor in the relevant field, and might be literally any length from a tweet up until this person submitted a 5-page 5-page written declaration, which has multiple supporting appendices to it, and distill that into a report for the city or for the benefit of policymakers. And that sort of work will be more tractable to computers than one expected a few years ago.
Yes, absolutely. And, just coming back to the stormwater strategy type idea, I think, there's really a lot of value there for far more human attention to be placed on the actually interesting parts of it. But that as long as we have a structure where, no, your job is to deliver this, there's a set of incentives there for that person, even if they would be more interested in doing the higher level work where human attention is adding value, to nonetheless push back against that component of their job to being automated by an AI, right? Because the deal isn't made explicitly of, no, you do that. And, so instead, out of purely rational concern to preserve their job, seek to inhibit that adoption, not only for themselves, but generally.
Yeah, and goes up the chain fractally as well. The humans belong to the monkeys, and we still have the monkey OS running in our brain a little bit. And if you wield a larger tribe, you are more powerful than someone who wields a smaller tribe. And so one of the long-standing pathologies of...
Status by headcount.
Yeah, status by headcount. One of the long-standing pathologies of government budget is regardless of your needs in the coming year, you will not be a successful administrator for very long if you ever ask for less budget than last year. In part because if you ever ask for less, someone will gladly ask for more, and you will never get the budget that you concede back. But for the same reason, if you have 100 people in your organization, that is some amount of status, and acceding to a reorganization where you would now be managing 70 people with 30 released to do more important things for the public, rather than, filing the forms they were filing last year, is not directly incentive compatible.
No.
And so people might be disinclined to do that.
I think also just, there's overlapping kind of problems here because, one of the difficulties of that, let's say, labor mobility issues that we were talking about earlier, is a collapse of interpersonal trust within these institutions as a result of the fact that you just probably don't know the manager all that well for all that long. And so to be able to tell him or her, oh, no, I could do this via AI, and I'd like to have the opportunity to do, Y and Z instead, is a very difficult conversation to have with somebody that barely knows you. Whereas if you've been in an organization for, 20 years and you've worked with this person, I think that's substantially, more tractable. And I think
in addition to interpersonal trust, where the crisis in institutions that people have identified in the last couple of years, which there's any number of factors in it, including like the institutions demonstrating less just capacity to get things done, the changed media environment, increasing politicization, et cetera, et cetera. But institutions viewing other institutions have a lower degree of regard for them than they did in the past, I believe. Is that commensurate with your experience?
I can certainly think of a range of specific examples of that. I don't know if I could comment that was a general trend. I suppose it's only natural, if the thesis of mine or ours is correct that, that there's a diminished capacity, then that natural flow and effect would be lower trust. But I think it's also related to this, this idea of a declining appetite for risk. And imagine you are, thinking back to this person, this public executive who's coming in and out of different roles every 2 years. They come in, something goes wrong. What you would do if you were intending on going to a different role somewhere else is to implement a new process. So you say, oh, this wasn't my fault, but we've got this new process that's going to make sure that this can never happen again, because we're going to go through it's going to go through a design review externally, and then, so you like, and then you end up with more and more like waterfall type processes where, you've got these checks and balances and so forth. But, at nowhere along the line, it's very difficult as well in that kind of environment to make any kind of argument that the optimal number of failures is not zero. Right?
As I mentioned in the original essay about that, and I'm snow cloning in it, a line from Dan Davies, an author who we also had on this podcast previously. But it is not maximally straightforward, but possible in private industry to say, we could tolerate a few more fraud losses if it increased our revenue. It is intensely difficult in the public sector to say, actually, I think a little bit more crime might be useful at the margins. Where actually, it wouldn't be too bad if welfare fraud was up by 10 points.
Well, I mean, even leaving aside criminal activity, I think it's almost impossible to have that conversation with respect to just, let's say, failure in general.
Yes.
Where if you're the executive who deliberately reduced like the risk management process in order to streamline it, and as a result of that something happened, which inevitably it will, then all that blame for that is going to fall on you as if you caused it yourself.
Right.
And there's no good standing in front of the media saying, well, yeah, but in general, over the next 30 years we expect costs to decline.
There's a bit of stare decisis and
what was that, sorry?
Sorry, stare decisis is a word often used in the United States legal system about letting the thing that has come before stand.
Oh, sure.
But for example, if you are the regulator who approves, self-driving cars without an extremely laborious study of safety, then the first time a self-driving car kills someone, it was like you personally stabbed that person in the chest.
Sure.
Whereas if you are merely the inheritor of the existing roadway system, which we all know will kill, statistical average in the United States is probably 30,000 people a year, then, well, we've always lost 30,000 people a year to roadway safety, and so you're not personally responsible for that.
Sure. So can I give you, there's some really great examples.
Oh, I've loved
process happening, like this risk aversion and layers of process being created. So this is not related to myself or any institution that I work for personally. But, during university, as a training as a civil engineer, you meet a lot of other civil engineers and we catch up from time to time. So you get a lot of interesting insights into other institutions. So there's one particular colleague of mine, friend, colleague, fellow student at university, who also trained to be a water engineer, who, when they started their career at a particular council, the process for replacing a length of pipe that had come up for renewal was that you take the form that was done the last time you had to replace a length of pipe, update the map, note any differences, and then go out a contractor that you probably had some degree of relationship with, that would, the contract of which would be renewed every 3 years. So we go out to market every 3 years and say, okay, we want, a new maintenance contractor. But in the meantime, that schedule of prices being done for this engineer, working as at the time, an intermediate engineer rather than a pure graduate, was the morning's work to do all of the planning work, get the contract out, get people beginning to, order in the parts required, everything else. Contract, obviously, the execution of it would take some time, but essentially you're talking about a morning's work for an intermediate engineer. So we might put a value on that of, after overheads, a few $100s. So now at a different institution, the same engineer, the process is now so convoluted that the price involved for just the planning and the contract procurement and all the rest of it, to get to the point where you could replace a length of pipe in that city, is greater than the total cost of the project 10 years ago at the start of his career. So before any actual work is done, just the design review, which is done through a panel of external consultants who decided amongst themselves which work and what price it would be. So
Mm-hmm.
I could, I look forward to having this person on once they leave their particular role to kind of do a debriefing on some of this. But
Mm-hmm.
this is again and again the same trend that I see, right across New Zealand and as far as I can tell, the Anglosphere in general, and possibly the world just as a result of the sort of incentives that we have. Well, I didn't necessarily see much in East Asia,
Mm-hmm.
but but this is where we're going, and at no point is anybody kind of incentivized to sort of step back and go, hold on, this is
Mm-hmm.
completely nuts. Our delivery rate now is 10% of what it was or what it needs to be in order to just renew our infrastructure at a timely rate such that, every 100 years all of the pipes are released.
Mm-hmm.
We're now 10% of that.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, walking through the capital of our city, of our nation in Wellington, there are just routinely large amounts of water spilling around the streets that when you observe the behavior of Wellingtonians are walking around with such kind of casualness that you could only assume it's been going on for months. And this,
This is sometimes referred to as Baumel's cost disease, although I think he has a different explanatory mechanism than that has come to mean as a metonym in communities like this one. I think one subgenre of this is that, not much, technically speaking, has changed about the pipe that we were buying 30 years ago versus the pipe we buy today. But if we were buying one pipe and one piece of paper 30 years ago, we're now buying one pipe and 12 pieces of paper. And it turns out we are very willing to, okay, perhaps not descriptively speaking accurate with respect to pipes specifically, but going with the metaphor, we are willing to purchase the pipe from, without loss of generality, China, and the cost of the pipe has gone down.
right.
But we are very unwilling, for good reasons, we are unwilling to import the Chinese regulatory state into our nations, and so the cost does not decrease. And so as you play that game for a little while, the total cost of it, as you mentioned, the cost that is attributable to regulatory overhead will swamp the cost that is the minimum necessary of labor and goods necessary to create something in the physical world. And
Sure.
at some point, one has to ask, what are we doing? But you've mentioned that you're working towards some level of reform for the civil service generally, or at least optimistic about it. And I also hope to share some optimism because otherwise, what are we doing here? What gives you optimism that we are not just in this downward spiral on capacity, that we could actually have nations that are with accomplishments that are worthy of those great nations?
A great question. I tend to think of, in the first instance, I'd say I'm optimistic because I see that this could just be, this is part of like a natural, or you can almost think of it as cyclical in a way. We talked about that dynamism shifting from the public to the private sector, some of these structural incentives at work and so on, in order to, and I think too about the need, let's say 20 years ago, around reforming some of these systems was probably pretty low. The capacity for a growing population and rapidly growing economy to support some degree of dead weight loss because systems weren't quite as optimal as they could have been, and there was an extra piece of paper, to use your metaphor. We doubled the amount of paperwork. Well, in actuality, in terms of the sort, possibly even you could say a good thing from the perspective of society as a whole, because the people that could have spent an inordinate amount of time and energy resolving that issue probably better off being here, or producing something new and something of value rather than the maintenance of infrastructure in the state. But I think we're at a point now where, the problems are sort of that complacency are becoming increasingly obvious. I think you've got a new generation of people keen to talk about them and just bring attention to some of these sorts of issues. And I think so. I think in terms of like each generation has its own challenges. And one of them for ours is going to be, okay, well, how do we, in some cases, rationalize the state? There's a great example of, you're talking about Japan earlier in depopulation. We have this is occurring in some of the more rural areas of New Zealand already due to fertility decline and net migration. But we have local governments that have a roading budget larger than their revenue, and so that they do other things as well, but are entirely reliant on central government subsidies in order for those roads to continue to be maintained. And at some point we need to be, it's inevitable that we're going to go, okay, well, the population of this place is half what it was. There's going to need to be some tough calls at some point, but hey, do we let those roads degrade a little bit and go back into a sort of a gravel? There's some degree of rationalization, as I said, is important. But more generally, I think, just interested, talented people seeing problems, thinking about the future of their nations, maybe hopefully the future of their kids if they end up having them, and that that problem's going to need to be resolved. And just I'm really optimistic just in that sense of the amount of attention and the rate of change in the amount of attention being paid to these sorts of things, and the sophistication of the conversation, that it's particularly obvious in places like this. But then the internet, I think, really is enabling of quite sophisticated, nuanced conversations, about some of these global issues that maybe weren't possible internally within one particular organization in one particular place at a particular time 30 years ago. So, yeah, I mean, that's one source of optimism. I'm like,
I think it is
highly convinced that everything's going to be okay. I think it's going to require a lot of people essentially like fulfilling their duty in a way, maybe as they see it, but nonetheless.
Yeah. I think it's nice to hear someone say forthrightly that the internet can be net positive for civil society in terms of debates and similar, because that is definitely not the received wisdom with respect to the impact of social media on the political conversation. But I think you are fundamentally accurate that the old way had some things to recommend it and some things to extremely anti-recommend it. There was a great deal of elitism, that decisions were made in the metaphorical and sometimes very literal smoky back room, that recounted in many histories of large public works projects. There was a great deal of experimentation done on society by a very small number of people who may not have gone about getting the consent of the citizenry to those experiments. And a bit unclear to me what the exact mix of things going forward will be, but it is nice that, we can now have a broad-based discussion in society in places like everywhere from the Thompson and Klein abundance book here in the United States, which a bit politically inflected, but they're talking about a reinvention of the government and decreasing the amount of particular bureaucratic processes while still wanting, I believe it would be characterizing them fairly to say that they want a very active and empowered state and a public safety net. And then some amount of enthusiasm in many places for, best and brightest wherever they found themselves in the economy could, through a variety of processes, spend some time in government or adjacent to government to reduce the amount of dysfunction we're seeing and just generally speaking, increase state capacity. And I think that's a topic that we could go another 12 hours on, but unfortunately, all good conversations must come to an end. Adam, where can people find you on the internet?
So I write at Alethios, ALETHIOS.substack.com. Public service is the name of that publication. And then also at Twitter at Alethios3.
Thanks very much for your time today. And for the rest of you, we'll see you next week on Complex Systems.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Complex Systems. If you have comments, drop me an email or hit me up at Patio11 on Twitter. Ratings and reviews are the lifeblood of new podcasts for SEO reasons, and also because they let me know what you like.